Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Brianne Eby, and I'm a policy analyst here at ENO. In today's webinar, we'll have two Mineta Transportation Institute researchers discussing their recently released report on the rules of the road of emerging personal transportation devices. Also known as micromobility, the number and use of these devices has exploded in recent years, highlighted by the recent arrival of electric scooters in cities. The report explores the degree to which states, cities, and college campuses are or are not regulating these new devices. Today we have two of the authors here, Asha Weinstein-Agarwal from San Jose State University and Kevin Feng from Sonoma State University. Asha and Kevin will review their findings and discuss recommendations from their recent report. After their presentation, we'll have plenty of time for questions, so be sure to get your questions in mind as they go along. For those listening in, you are encouraged to submit questions and comments through the questions function on the webinar website. You don't have to wait until they are done to submit these questions. You can do that at any point. Thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. And with that, take it away, Kevin and Asha.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Feng. I'm one of the authors here of the study here on how and where should I ride this, rules of the road for personal transportation devices. And I'm here with my colleague, Asha Weinstein-Agarwal. And again, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So as Brianne mentioned in the introduction, we've had lots of these new devices show up in cities in recent years. From motorized scooters, motorized skateboards, roller skates, hoverboards, Segways, which here today we are calling personal transportation devices. Before we get into the results of our study, I'd like to acknowledge our third co-author, Ashley Hooper from UC Irvine, as well as our team of research assistants. And a big thank you to the Mineta Transportation Institute for funding this research. Which they did even before the introduction of motorized scooters in cities. So I appreciate their jumping ahead with us for this study. All right, so as I mentioned, so we're describing these devices as personal transportation devices. Again, not the only thing that these are called here as they have been popping up in cities in recent years. What we are thinking about here as what PTDs are, so this broad suite of small devices that provide relatively low speed mobility, faster than walking speed, but approaching or around the speed that bicycles go. We are including in our definition both motorized and human-powered devices. So human-powered kick scooters and motorized scooters, motorized skateboards and human-powered skateboards. And in this, we are including older devices that have been traditionally thought of for recreation, as well as a lot of these new startup, new invention kinds of devices. I will note here, for the purposes of our study, we did not include bicycles and electric bicycles as personal transportation devices, although they are sometimes included in descriptions of micromobility. We decided to defer to the large body of research on bicycling and focus just on sort of these newer, more emerging devices. So, of course, the thing that's been really driving the conversation here in the last couple of years has been the advent of electric scooters and shared electric scooter systems in cities recently. Would like to point out, though, that even those aren't necessarily that new in terms of technology. So here we have an array of uses of scooters in the early 20th century. We've got Amelia Earhart there on the left riding a motorized scooter in 1935, U.S. Postal Service workers in the 1910s, and perhaps sort of a foreshadowing some of the issues we have here today. On the right there, we have actors Humphrey Bogart and Alan Jenkins being stopped on their scooters, presumably for going too fast at their Warner Brothers studio location. One of the things that sort of makes the question here of the rules of the road for PTDs kind of challenging as well is that, again, whilst a lot of these devices have been around for a while, you're getting lots of new devices that keep popping up. as motor technology and battery technology improve, you're seeing people slap these on kind of just about anything you can imagine. We've got sort of a motorized bus / skateboard there on the left. That was seen in Oakland, California. And then there on the right, we've got a drivable cooler. All right, so here in our study, we had kind of two big research questions here. First, we were looking at what rules of the road currently exist in terms of how users should use PTDs. And then after taking a look at what the existing regulations were, then we tried to ask ourselves, well, then what should be the rules of the road that should apply to users when they ride and operate these devices. I will note here we are focused on how users should ride the devices. As part of the study, we did not focus on permitting of shared PTD services, which has been, of course, a big question in cities here in the past couple of years. All right, for our methods, we looked at regulations in all 50 states, 5 US territories, 101 cities arranged throughout all 50 states of the country, as well as 20 university campuses. And then after we looked at existing regulations, we then tried to craft and try to answer the question here of what should the rules of the road be. So after taking a look at the existing regulations, best practices, maybe not so best practices, as well as a review of literature, we crafted some recommendations for what those rules might look like. And then after drafting the initial version of this, we conducted 21 interviews with stakeholders and then went through several iterations of this model code before arriving at our final set of recommendations. All right, so with that, what did we find? So what did we learn about the current rules of the road that are out there for personal transportation device users? Our big takeaway here is there's pretty much no normal in terms of how these devices are regulated among PTDs from place to place. Overall, we called it sort of here a murky regulatory environment with rules on PTDs often not very common. When they did exist, they were sometimes quite thin, and the regulations that did exist were not necessarily all that consistent with each other. And we'll take a look at some examples of how that is here in the upcoming slides. All right, so at the most basic level, what did the rules cover? So rules covered what people had to do, what people could do, what people could not do, and what people did not have to do. So lots of different approaches here in how rules were written. For the most part, they covered how people should ride when they ride, so certain behaviors that they should or shouldn't do, like whether yield to pedestrians, wear helmets, needing driver's licenses. And then we also had a common type of regulations were on where users could, should, or shouldn't ride. From the existing regulations, we did notice a number of things that we could consider as problems with regulations. So first off, as I mentioned a second ago, rules were pretty much not very common for many of the PTDs that are out there. For example, at the state level, where modes of transportation are typically defined, with the exception of Segways, most of the devices were not regulated or defined at the state level, which can have some ramifications on how then cities or campuses regulate them down the line. Human-powered PTDs were regulated a little bit more frequently at the city level, but again, even there, most of the devices did not have specific regulations on them. As a result, that led to many PTDs being grouped with more common modes of transportation, particularly vehicles and pedestrians. But this wasn't necessarily very consistent in terms of what counted under what category. So for example, you had 20 states covering human-powered PTDs as vehicles, and then 3 taking a very opposite approach and regulating them as pedestrians. For motorized PTDs, they were often vehicles. However, Segways, were a notable exception to those where in fewer cases, segways were defined as vehicles, and in several cases defined as pedestrians. And you had cases where states would regulate segways as pedestrians, but not human-powered PTDs. Something else was also problematic. We did see several examples of communities outright banning PTDs, which from a complete streets and freedom of travel standpoint is a bit of an issue there. And we did see several examples of where in a place they may not have outright banned a PTD, but several of their regulations in combination can effectively create a ban. So for example, it was not uncommon for PTDs to be banned on sidewalks, so you have to ride on a road, but then you get additional regulations that ban riding on high-speed arterials, which then leaves trips to certain destinations or trips on certain routes not legal. And then finally, we have lots of inconsistency here in terms of how the same device was regulated inconsistently from place to place, where you get the same place taking two devices, say motorized skateboards and motorized scooters, that are functionally very similar in terms of their characteristics. They would regulate those very differently. So that's kind of what we saw here with existing regulations. And now I will hand it off to Dr. Agarwal, who will talk about our recommendations here for what the rules should be.
Thank you, Kevin. So as Kevin explained, we took a huge amount of information and went through an iterative process to try to figure out what we think the sort of right course forward would be. And Kevin, why don't you advance the slide? So the first thing I want to quickly cover is, before we even got into the specifics of what text we thought should be in a code, we realized that we wanted to figure out what principles we felt were important that should underline whatever choices went into the recommended code. The first is pretty obvious: protecting public safety. But secondly, we really wanted to reiterate in our minds that we want to permit PTD use as a convenient travel option. As Kevin pointed out a moment ago, it's a matter of kind of freedom of travel. It fits with a lot of the spirit of complete streets and other more, sort of contemporary approaches to street planning. Thirdly, and this was really important, we felt that it just wasn't working, and certainly wasn't going to work into the future, to regulate each device type differently. First of all, there are already so many different ones. You've seen samples of them in the pictures in our slides, that it would be completely infeasible to have a separate set of rules for each of these. And then there's the fact that at least for some of us who live in places like San Francisco, it feels like every month some new device is invented and you see it rolling around. And obviously it just is not practical for cities or states to have to go back and write new rules every time a new device comes out. And then finally, and really important, and we just kept coming back to this principle, is we felt it was important to have rules that are easy to understand and remember. I mean, in many ways, these rules function as a way of educating the public about how they're supposed to use the devices. And if it's too complicated, it's just not going to work. And also, it's not just riders who really should have at least a basic understanding of the rules. Other road users, whether that's pedestrians or car drivers, are also going to be safer and more comfortable if they have a general sense of what to expect from these PTD users. Kevin, next slide. So we came up, and I want to share, obviously not all the details, but just a few of the core elements that went into the eventual text we proposed, which is about 3 pages, and we have a report up on the website that has all the specific language. But one of the first things is we decided that states are really the right entity to set comprehensive rules for PTD riders, but it's also important to give local governments the flexibility to set some additional limits when local conditions warrant that. Similarly, with bicycles and cars, we don't have completely different rules every time you cross city lines or go from one county to another. It's much more practical to have these set at the state level. Next slide. Secondly, as I alluded to earlier, our definitions regulate PTDs as a class, not device by device. Next slide. So here you're going to see the language that we used ultimately to define this class of PTDs. And the essence buried in all these details is that it's a device to carry one person, that it can be operated using human, electric, or motor power, and that it have a designated footprint, so to speak, on the ground. As I'll explain in a minute, we felt that PTDs in many cases are appropriate on sidewalks, so we wanted to define these not greater than a side that could reasonably be accommodated even on the wider, narrower sidewalks in our communities. So we landed on not greater than 24 inches wide, which is, you know, like a standing adult, roughly that size, many of us, and then 42 inches long. We also specifically call out that if you don't fall into this particular set of criteria, you will be regulated as a bicycle. And that was a decision we made so that sort of all devices would be covered. Either you're a PTD or you're a bicycle, but you can't escape and be nothing and not have clear regulations. And then we also specified that we're excluding bikes, electric bikes, and then mobility devices like wheelchairs if they're used by people who have mobility-related disabilities. Most states have already got quite specific rules, usually very permissible, for how people can use wheelchairs and such, and we certainly didn't want to take away any of that freedom and flexibility. Next slide. Third thing is we felt that it would be appropriate in a lot of cases to craft the PTD rules essentially to mimic bicycle rules. And this, in some cases, it just seemed to make sense because there were a lot of kind of similarities in these devices and bicycles in terms of the physics and how they get ridden, but also, again, going back to that principle of trying to keep the rules as simple as possible. It's obviously easier to remember one than two. So for example, with helmets, I have my personal opinions about whether people should ride helmets or not, but our rules just state that PTD riders must follow whatever the state rules for helmet use for bicyclists may be. Next slide. Finally, and I know that this is, I think, probably the most controversial part of our recommendations, but Kevin and Ashley and I put a lot of thought, talked to many people, and ultimately felt that PTD riders should be permitted on both streets, so in the roadway and on sidewalks, but subject to some very specific rules to protect everybody's safety and freedom of movement. Next slide. And the sidewalks piece is important because a lot of communities have started the process of banning the devices on sidewalks, and understandably there are very important safety concerns. But I think what these blanket bans have been sort of missing or not fully considering is the fact that sidewalks in the US are not all like the one on the left. I think we can all agree that that sidewalk is not an appropriate place for people to be wheeling along briskly on a PTD. And yet, if you look at the picture on the right, which frankly is probably more common in the US than the picture on the left. Here we have this big arterial. I don't know, but I'm guessing the speed limit is at least 35 miles an hour, quite possibly higher. So really not a comfortable or safe place to have a PTD in this roadway. And then you have a lovely wide sidewalk with absolutely nobody on it at all, pedestrian or otherwise. And so, isn't it sort of a waste of that sidewalk not to have somebody making use of it? Next slide. So where we landed is that we say that, PTD riders, if they choose to ride on a sidewalk, have to do a number of things to keep everybody safe. They have to slow when approaching or overtaking anybody else on the sidewalk. The next one is key. They have to maintain a distance of at least 2 feet away from anybody else on the sidewalk. They have to make an audible signal if they're overtaking somebody. If they're entering intersections, they need to slow to a walking speed. And then finally, if they can't, if conditions are such that they really can't abide to be, stay 2 feet away from everybody, or otherwise respect pedestrians, the rider just needs to dismount. This is your sign that this is not a sidewalk where the conditions make it reasonable to actually be riding your device. Next slide. So with that, we have our full report up on the MTI website and all kinds of nitty-gritty details and long tables explaining what different cities and states do for anyone who wants to delve into those. And it's not up yet, but probably by the end of the week, maybe early next week, we're going to be adding to that MTI web page a link to a folder with essentially the Excel documents that we use to collect every bit of language we could find in all of our jurisdictions of study that might relate to PTDs. So you will see the definition of skateboards in 101 cities, if it's there, 50 states, 5 US territories, and so on. So I think that will provide a wealth of information for people who are more interested in a specific device type or particular place. And I know that we have some time now for questions, but both Kevin and I are passionate about this subject and would be delighted to talk to anybody later on to, help you think through the specifics of the community where you're working, to hear your feedback or suggestions and anything else you might want to talk about.
Okay, thanks very much, Kevin and Asha. And to the audience members tuned in, don't forget that you can still submit questions through the questions function for the speakers. And we will be posting today's slides. That was kind of the first one that came up. So you can find the video as well as a copy of the presentation posted to Eno's website after today's event. And with that, I will get into a couple of the questions. So I'll start with one on methods. Can you guys dig a little bit deeper into, I guess, just some broad themes in your methods here? So there was a question that came in wondering if you evaluated federal codes, so specifically looking at, looks like there's one on bicycle transportation and pedestrian walkways. I'm not sure if you'll be able to get super specific into that right now, but just talk a little bit about your evaluation of federal codes. But then I'm also wondering other things such as how were the universities that you looked at chosen? How do you update this information?
Kevin, maybe I'll take the federal and then you can do the others, if that's okay. So one key distinction is we were looking at the regulations on users. So if I have a device, where can't I ride? So that is actually not something that has been in our country regulated at the federal level. Now, the federal government obviously has a great deal of guidance for public agencies when they're creating facilities. What should a bike lane look like? Where can it be? Those sorts of things. But there's not actually federal material on the rules of the road. That has been seen as a states' rights matter.
And then in terms of college campuses, so we look at 20, which is not a huge number. So those were mostly chosen subjectively. We tried to pick an array of private and public four-year universities that we knew were in sort of different kinds of campus types. So some larger sprawling campuses to some more compact urban campuses. But as for kind of the last question there as to kind of the updating of these over time, so that was, we did look at these in the fall of sort of the spring of 2018 for the most part. But we do think it would be valuable if we don't quite have the answer to this just yet, but a place where sort of all these regulations could be documented and updated over time.
And just to jump into, so yes, we have given you a snapshot, kind of, roughly a year ago, this is what the rules were. Some places have definitely made updates since then, but my guess is that the key findings and overall patterns haven't really changed. But we've talked a lot about what an incredible resource it would be to have someone who can just collect these and keep them updated, even if it's just in a more wiki style, as people volunteer with updates, as opposed to an organization comprehensively sort of going out and looking every year for updates. The latter is incredibly time consuming, as we'll be happy to tell you in great detail if you want to know. But right now we don't have anybody who has the bandwidth to host that.
Great, thanks both of you. There's been a couple of questions about the stakeholders that were involved, both in terms of who did you interview for this research? Specifically, somebody asked about lawyers, and somebody else asked about private sector companies. To what extent did both of those and any other stakeholders play in your development of this work? And then also wondering how you anticipate cities, states, whoever, using this information moving forward.
Well, the stakeholders, we did our best to sort of approach people with very different perspectives. So we talked to some folks who work for these shared device firms, these tech companies. We talked to city planners, we talked to a state transportation planner, municipal attorney, someone who writes state regulatory code, somebody who is a representative who works for an organization that represents the elderly, also somebody who represents pedestrians. We talked to a bike advocate and so on. So obviously we couldn't cover every important perspective, and we only talked usually to one or maybe two people from each group, but we got a pretty wide array of viewpoints, and it definitely, as we talked to people, we would sort of change what we thought the right version was. Kevin, do you want to talk about next steps?
Oh, yes. So next steps. So that is an interesting one. Some of the recommendations. Well, our recommendations here are at the state level, and so actually, so we did talk to, as Asha mentioned, the representatives from sort of a state legislature association. And so there has been a lot of action in terms of, or at least interest in state level regulation on these devices here recently. We do hope this can inform some proposals that might be proposed here at the state level, particularly since so few states currently have specific regulations on PTDs. There isn't necessarily a lot of existing regulations that our recommendations would be in conflict with.
And also, we recognize that if you're, say, a city or a county in a state that doesn't regulate this and that permits local authority on these matters, then almost everything in our, quote, state level rules of the road could make sense to be adopted by a city. And indeed, we sort of, it's our judgment that it would be wise to do so. But in certain cases, the state's own codes wouldn't permit that.
Great, thank you. There's been a couple of questions coming in about enforcement and whether that was something that was evaluated or how maybe you might evaluate enforcement in the future.
Yes, so enforcement is definitely an interesting question. So when we were trying to write our recommendations, so we were also trying to think about how enforceable or not enforceable sort of the different recommendations we would have. And so some of the feedback that we got from some of our interviewees, particularly at the city level, in terms of what they were hearing from their public safety officials, or at least kind of the key here was to try to keep these somewhat here on the simpler side, so that they at least had the opportunity of being enforced. From what we gather, there wasn't necessarily a lot of people telling us that they thought that their public safety officials would be going out on sidewalks and doing a lot of dedicated enforcement. But if they were, kind of the simpler rules would be something that would be easier for them to enforce.
We also thought quite a bit, for example, about speed limits on sidewalks. And there is precedent. For example, bicycles. There are speed limits on some recreational riding trails for bicycles, which do get enforced by sheriff's offices or whoever's in charge using radar or whatnot. So it's not out of the question that you could regulate the speed of a PTD that way, but it's obviously quite tricky to do. The police are not going to be spending a lot of time on it. And so we really tried to focus more on describing behaviors people would take that would keep everybody safe. You may not have a good judge of whether you're going 4 miles an hour or 6 miles an hour, but you probably have a pretty good sense if you're 2 feet away from people. So that was how we approached
Great.
that.
And we'll do one more. We're just about out of time here, but hopefully we can sneak one more in. Somebody was wondering if you considered adding speed as part of the definition of PTDs.
Well, this is my favorite one, so I'll start, and Kevin can add in. So it occurred to me that if you look at how we regulate motorized vehicles, we have pretty much, with very few exceptions, the same rules for any vehicle from a regular old passenger car, a little two-person electric smart car, to a Ferrari or a semi-truck. And obviously the Ferrari is going to go a whole lot faster than the smart car, but we don't ban the Ferrari from places where those speeds are completely inappropriate. We simply say, you have to go slow like everybody else. And so to us, that same principle really seemed to make sense applying it to PTDs, because first of all, people can go very different speeds, both on the human-powered ones. Some people can go quite fast, and there's no reason you can't ride a motorized one at a pretty leisurely, sedate pace. Kevin, I know this is a key question. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I know we do see with electric bicycles, the regulations based on the speed of the device. But at least at this point, we sort of saw that one as the e-bikes as an outlier compared to as what Asha was mentioning here in terms of motor vehicles. So we were thinking there from a consistency of multiple modes of transportation to go kind of without that principle in this case.
Great. Thanks very much to Kevin and Asha. This was super interesting research, and we look forward to following, seeing where it goes. Thank you all to the audience as well for your participation. Again, we will be posting today's slides on our website, so be sure to take a look at those. Just a few announcements from the events page on ENO's website. If you are in the DC area or will be on June 6th, don't forget to take a look into our 27th Annual Leadership Awards reception, hosted for the first time in the historic Terminal A lobby of the Washington National Airport. Should be a fun event. You might also consider registering for our two-part webinar on microtransit later this summer. Be on the lookout for that. I'd also like to encourage everybody to subscribe to ENO Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. Once again, thanks for your participation and have a great afternoon.